So I'll try to do like the Cirque du Soleil, some acrobatic movements to try to find something in common in between everything that we have heard this afternoon. Maybe that could become like a starting point for a conversation. Of course, please help me, everyone, if you want to intervene on anything or raise more.
You're all alone.
I'm all alone. That's good. This is the like punishment for being so strict with the timing, I can imagine. But yeah, I deserve it. So, okay, let's say one thing. Let's try to use this difficulty that I find, which is diversity, as the fil rouge of, at least just to start to break the ice, as the fil rouge of what we witnessed this afternoon. I try to raise some issues after each one's presentation, and let's see if someone wants to comment. The microphone is there. Of course, we had in the very beginning this very interesting story by Ole about Roundtable, and I see the topic of the narrative was built up to explain the story of the architect. I'll also go into narratives soon. And what I found very interesting was this intention, this need of the architect to continuously reinvent or differentiate himself from what he saw as fashion or avant-garde, I would say, in a way. And then I find very interesting that the topic of avant-garde that you raised in the end somehow works with what you Adam just said, of this idea of taking stuff from the past and reusing them, so in a way it anticipates some kind of postmodern attitude, I would say, or anyway, I see a connection between your two presentations. But in this case, differentiation is, of course, related to a mainstream, let's say, movement or genealogy. We had Giovanni speaking about multiple epistemologies, we could say. So again, yes, there's the topic of multiplicity or differentiation in terms that I totally agree with you. We definitely live in a period in which many different discourses coexist at the very same time. It becomes kind of impossible to decide which one is the official one, so they are all official because they exist, which is also, I think, interesting. I wonder if there's a way to evaluate, since they coexist, if someone is desirable or not, which ones should be forwarded. Can we assess a critical judgment on them, since we understand that they have the right to exist at the same time? And then I have something I found interesting, since you're fragmenting, but you stopped at the level of categories. You still used categories such as green, parametric, and so on. But what we saw today, also with Tal, for example, narration, is that to me, maybe today the most efficient kind of discourse about architecture is the narrative that goes down to the single project. Talking about projects still all together, to build up a category that keeps together many different examples, I wonder if it's still possible, contemporary, maybe you're already in a much smaller narrative level than the small narratives, that are not the grand narratives anymore. This is my impression. About your interesting contribution, Eli, I already anticipated you more or less the question. Yes, we have this topic of the differentiation from the globalization or from the global style, somehow trying to contrast this tendency of the capitalist city to grow in a certain direction, to give a certain image of itself. But then, I mean, we saw this year the Pritzker Prize, which was given to RCR architects, completely misinterpreted, in my opinion, with this idea of the local that dialogues with the global, which is, I don't think it's exactly what they do, but by the way, that's not the point. What I'm saying is that I kind of have the impression that also being local today means being global. I mean, cities have to grow in a more and more possible local way to differentiate themselves in the market of like tourism and finance and so on. So probably this topic of the global as something with a homogeneous aesthetic is not really more working, or even the local is global because you need to be local in order to be part of the global market, okay? So this was my perplexity, or at least something that came to me when I saw your presentation. We skipped the Cézanne who didn't come. Yes, I already said something about your presentation, this reconstructing the narrative, narrowing it down to one single object, architectural object. I think it's a very efficient way of dealing with architecture history or theory today. what I find interesting is that in the very same object can be the object of different interpretations, which are the ones that you have been bringing to us. Of course, one can be convinced by your interpretation, or by Aurelius, or by the many more that can come, and the one that comes afterward.
Of course not.
Of course not. What I was wondering is then, yes, if there's a differentiation and multiplicity of interpretations, again, where do we stand? How should we choose? And is it really important to choose one? Or maybe should we evaluate the effects of the building? And to me, this possibility to continuously reinterpret and rebuild the discourse also somehow needs an evaluation about where to stand every time. Or maybe it's just we keep on producing new narratives about the same object. This could also be probably what we are supposed to do. And then Adam, we already had this conversation last time. You know, I'm also very much into social media and the way in which the image is circulating. Your presentation reminded me very much of three philosophers or sociologists, let's say from the beginning of the 20th century: Georg Simmel, Walter Benjamin, Marshall McLuhan. Simmel, they both speak of the same thing, but in different terms, but they speak the same thing. Simmel said that in the new city, there's so many stimulations that our behavior becomes the behavior of the blasé. So we have to protect ourselves with becoming indifferent to the amount of stimulus. Benjamin spoke of the same thing in terms of a shock. He referred to cinema, but again, shock, so we distance ourselves because of the shock. Marshall McLuhan was speaking of the same thing in terms of amputation. We cannot cope with all this amount of stimuli, so we amputate ourselves, we extend ourselves on technology, because otherwise this would be too much. And so this is like all the things I've been thinking while listening to your very interesting presentations. I hope there's enough now to start a conversation which maybe grows organically. And of course, if anyone from the public wants to intervene, you're more than welcome. But who wants to take the microphone and start to answer to any one of these topics I've been bringing to the floor? I hear you. Did I? It doesn't look like it, does it? Was it so difficult?
Have a go. Okay, I start.
I'll pick it up. Anyone can answer anyone's question. Not that,
well, I'm not sure there was a question. I think because Adam brought up postmodernism, it's kind of helpful as a kind of umbrella for pluralism, diversity, things that don't fit together. I would say that I think we have to question some of your terms, right? I mean, high art, architecture is high art, not the same as disciplinary specificity. I see mega differences between how architecture operates in Anglo-Saxon countries like the US and the UK, where the difference and distance between industry and what you get in schools and that kind of architectural journalism is massive compared to countries, northern countries, Switzerland, you could say, Sweden, Denmark, where architects are involved in mass housing. Not the case in the US, not the case in Britain. So disciplinary specificity and high architecture is not quite the same thing. But I think I want to actually connect between you and Ellie's presentation. I'm wondering whether there's such a difference if we look at the post-modernism you're trying to exalt and the kind of slick architecture of Zaha Hadid or the more minimalism of the last decades, whether from the perspective of, let's say, neoliberalism, for example, there's a different strategy, but the purposes are quite similar.
I would expand that even to the vernacular.
So there you go. Take the microphone. And
I would expand that even to the vernacular. That that the northern Italian city that fashions itself with stone houses and slate roofs is the same kind of identity politics that Zaha Hadid projects. There is no difference on that political or ideological level. There's a huge difference in the aesthetic.
So,
what? I'm not sure what I should respond to, but for me, there's a danger nowadays of leveling discourses, which kind of put everything on the same platform and equate different ideas as all relatively acceptable. And I think, I'm personally of the opinion that it's time we assume a higher ground in a way by looking at the real problems out there. So no, it's not the same as the approach that some architects today take towards questions of social housing or questions of urban planning are not the same as the approaches taken by the people in the 20s and 30s. And we cannot reduce that only to Le Corbusier or Gropius, because there were some really good urban planning schemes during those times. I'm thinking of Ernest May and others in Frankfurt. So, we cannot put them all on the same level and say it's just a question of aesthetic taste. Definitely all of them were working under certain economic and political imperatives, and all of them had to somehow satisfy certain social and economic agendas, but the purpose and the objective were completely different. And I think this is an issue that we cannot take lightly anymore. It's not a question of taste. I don't know if that was
Yeah, I don't know. While I was hearing your speech, I was thinking about St. Peter's, Michelangelo's St. Peter, and thinking about the fact that it was. I was thinking about Renaissance in general, and how we could describe Renaissance architecture in the same terms that you describe internationalism for Schumacher, etc. The same architecture everywhere, big construction, big things, no sensibilities for the places, and so on. Then Anna came and said almost the same thing, and so I was thinking this thing, and I don't know if I have to answer to your questions about the problem of evaluation. From what I said, each architecture must be, or each style, if you want, each filter bubble, I don't know how to call it, must be judged within its own terms, within its own aesthetical terms. And what I don't like, what I don't bear is the fact that some kind of isms pretend to be better than others, but not for the actual reasons. I mean, green architecture says I'm better because I'm good, I'm saving the world, and so on, which is actually not true. Because, for example, in Italy, Bosco Verticale, I don't know if you know it, there was on the newspapers there was written, "This skyscraper will save the world." But if you read the tests about its sustainability, it is not sustainable. It is just what I said in my speech, to convey an idea of sustainability, and these are the terms within which you have to judge Bosco Verticale and postmodern architecture and modern architecture, because anyway, it's always, in my opinion, it's always a question of aesthetical terms. And I mean, a building may be more useful, more cost-effective, but if you choose to call that building an architecture must be valued within its own aesthetical terms.
Yeah, so what you said was really interesting, because over the past sort of decade, there's been, as we were sort of like living through the sort of last stages of the sort of neoliberal age, as far as I think we see it coming to an end now. But architects,
It's not really coming to an end.
That's a very, very open question there. But architects effectively felt for quite a long time that they were just doing window dressing, right? So there was, in the UK, and I'm sure in everywhere else, there's a sort of desire for architecture to become visionary, political, an active agent once again to try and create some kind of like alternative world, sort of to propose some kind of genuine change. Now, that's incredibly valid and really important, but for me at the moment, a lot of these discussions tend to get mixed, because for instance, my interest does lie. I find that those discussions very interesting. But at the same time, I'm very interested in architecture with a capital A as a sort of aesthetic enterprise that's sort of a metaphorical representation or mirror of the world around us and the culture around us. And for me, they overlap in many ways, but they have their own discourses. And on the one hand, one is very operative, and it can be absolutely shorn of any aesthetics whatsoever, because, you know, if you're going to be proposing a new legal structure for new types of social housing that are going to be funded by a particular type of bank that's related to national debt in a particular way, or is tied into pension funds in a particular way that's going to provide the capital needed, and so on and so forth. That doesn't have to have an aesthetic at all, right? That's the kind of the construction of that policy is an intent that is operative. And that's, you know, that can be architectural, absolutely, but it doesn't have to look like a Schwuppie-Whoopie Zaha thing. It doesn't have, you know, it could also look like a really happy Sotzas thing. It could look like anything. I mean, you have Ricardo Bofill doing social housing for, was it Mitterrand? No, it was before. Yeah, it was that makes sense then.
It was before Mitterrand.
It was before Mitterrand, yeah. It was just before Mitterrand. But, you know, he was doing social housing, but it looked a lot like scaled-up versions of the extremely right-wing projects that were happening in the UK, or were being imagined at the time in the UK. So the aesthetics almost didn't matter.
It looked like some of the projects you showed also.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is that there's a very fluid relationship for me between architecture as aesthetics and architecture as an operative concern in relation to real policy. And they're both valid and they're both really important. I just think that we should be careful at separating the two whenever we talk about particular instances. And I tend, especially now, I tend to talk about, at this moment in my life, the aesthetic side. That's what I'm really fascinated by. But I think they're both really...
But they're not separate things. I mean, this is the issue. They're not separate things. There are overlaps between these different dimensions, and we have to be really aware of these different issues. To respond to your question that you raised before we even took the break, you know, I don't think that global architecture nowadays is responding to the localities, except in minute areas, and I showed an example, one example out of many, which is Foster's market in Abu Dhabi, and of course maybe Jean Nouvel could put it in this. But the rest is you know, I think there's a complete disregard for what I would say place or geography. Over the past month, I visited by chance 3 different cities. Oman, I was yesterday in Kaunas, in Lithuania, and also Abu Dhabi. And in all 3 of them, you know, I went to a mall, each case. Every mall looked the same, like the other one. So this is an example of the way, you know, this kind of standardization is happening. And I don't have an easy answer or, you know, solution to this issue, because you could claim that modernism also did the same thing in the 40s and 30s. But no, you know, if you go and look carefully at the particularities of modernism in Kaunas, in Beirut, in Tehran, in other places, we found that there was always this kind of dialectical relationship with the place, which I think, personally, is an important issue.
I'm much more critical about this idea of place-based architecture, but that has to do probably with experiences I have. You know, I'm situated right now in Salt Lake City, Utah, and there is, you know, place-based architecture. It means basically the architecture of the pioneers, of the Mormon pioneers from the 1840s and 1850s.
That's not
or it means the Spanish pueblo from the 17th and 16th century, which is also highly problematic. Or it means the, you know, contemporary glass steel architecture of, you know, the Sahas work or whatever, and that is also highly problematic. So I think the idea of, you know, place-based architecture has a huge problem exactly from that perspective. The shopping malls you just described, that is the old school kind of shopping malls. The new school shopping malls, the new school shopping malls, the new concepts of shopping malls is actually to induce, you know, I don't know, in Salt Lake City Creek. So they have, since the city was built around this little water feature, they have an artificial water feature, not the real one. They didn't dig it out. It's still canalized. But they put an artificial water feature along an experiential pathway with some nature and with neo-historic architecture that is supposed to represent this place. So I think in this you can find also, you know, let's say at the German example, at the Hugo Boss outlet in what is it? Near Stuttgart, where they basically reassess an industrial architecture of the brick of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, when Boss, by the way, produced for the Nazis. But when Boss started to, you know, become really big, they reassessed this industrial architecture as the architecture of the place that delivers to the contemporary shopper, which is not even an arcade anymore. It's not an enclosed space. It's now a series of pavilions which play on a series of motifs that are established by industrial architecture. So it's a new industrial look, neo-loft look, but of new buildings. So I think, you know, and that is very place-based, no question. It's about an industrial city, and the architecture speaks about this industrial heritage, but it's completely fake as, you know, the malls have been talking about. So I don't think that there's a huge difference.
I'll expand on that. As you see, we found something to talk about. Right?
Yeah.
I'll expand on that a bit, because also when I was looking at some massive development in London, and it's actually quite, for British context, quite sophisticated. It's still age compared to the stuff you see elsewhere. But again, what you see are the kind of artisan shops, which are supposed to leave us. It's called London Island City. It's awful. And then, of course, if you look at the booklets, you have artisan shops, which are supposed to be about authenticity, but all with that kind of Photoshop sheen. And of course, you can see how there's a problem of the general, the universal, which can't really do the specific. It's impossible. Under those circumstances, the specific can't even emerge, right? It always ends up like that. But I would like to also, because Adam before was talking about, actually, following the footsteps, I dare say, of crazy Leon Kriel. Because this idea of separating, let's say, that was Kriel's ambition, right? Neoclassicism from Speer, right? Cleansing neoclassicism from Nazi. And the argument goes, it's based on the idea that the architectural styles, right? Try to reduce it to styles rather than something which is more essential, right? Kind of loose, and we talk about association, and therefore nothing which is round, things can be changed, associations can be changed. The problem is, or the issue is, that also the political itself is symbolic. The heart, if you read political theory of politics, is the symbolic, which itself is always vulnerable to political shifts, to reframing, which is the task of politicians to change the framing of things. So also in politics themselves, there is a kind of vulnerability we also find in these associations. So obviously, they matter, because that is what politics is, even if they are vulnerable to shifts, changes, reappropriations, misunderstandings, and so on. So I would also disagree with the desire to separate these issues. Of course, you can use different readings, but if you want to stay on an aesthetic level, this requires a certain blindness, self-concealing to it, I dare say.
No, I just think that I didn't express myself very well, in the sense that I don't think that there's a total separation, and there's a fluidity between the two of them, and there's an interrelationship in specific moments, and they need to be analysed, case by case. But it's like Wittgenstein and the word. It's through use that it gains meaning, and I think it's the same thing with architectural language. So I'm not saying that the language in no way can mean something specific in a particular place and time at all. Fascist architecture in given moments used the classical language, and it absolutely meant that in that moment, because it was being used in that way in a consistent and concerted manner by a political group. But at the same time, I guess my meaning is at the same time, in the United States, the same architectural language was being used in a very consistent, clear and concerted way as the Republican language of architecture. In France it was Republican, but then Stalin started using it as well as the language of, I don't know how to describe his reign. No, his political regime.
Stalinism.
Yeah, exactly. So I absolutely...
Are you like communism?
Well, it's different. Oh, sorry, I keep doing this. Diverting you guys. No, but I guess what I mean is I kind of agree with you totally, but I was just trying to say that at the same time there's a fungibility about style. So it can transmute from one place to another depending on use, and it is us that creates that association, but the association is not fixed.
May I help you? I think what you have been trying to say is, just to get away from the style, I can say we can pick up on the sustainable architecture, since that seems to be a safer place. There's a performance level of sustainable architecture of figures, of what a facade does, and what kind of material does, and what user patterns do to the building, and so on and so forth. But that hasn't said anything about architecture, right? Yeah. That's the ideal, or the reflection, whatever you use the term style, right? And I think you have the same feeling that if we get stuck on this, strata of, what are the political circumstances? What is the law? What is the financial systems? What are building cooperatives? If architects just become these social workers on that level, we lose out on the disciplinarity. The idea you try to say is basically to introduce aestheticism through the back door in order to have to again strengthen that link that there is no form without content and no content without form. I hope.
No.
Okay.
But that's also good at
Yeah, it's a good.
Is there a question?
It's a good position.
Very welcome.
Thank you. I had a question for Ili that kind of relates to Giovanni and Adam's arguments, and Adam's kind of argument about relieving judgment from architecture and putting it as sort of late in an experiential process as possible. And you said that there is no junk space, just a matter of judgment. I would take that quite literally. And then linking back to your criticism of the fact that these malls look the same in different places. And I wanted to kind of open up to see, is there a possibility, if we take this to the extremes, that your specific eyes in this moment when you visit these places is a judgment placed too early? I mean, for instance, we've lived in Bangkok, where I enjoy the malls massively, and I explored them and mapped them and looked at details and compared them and enjoyed that massively. And then there are perhaps other problems with the building typology of malls, but if we talk about the experiential aspects of aesthetics here, and maybe if the question could be framed specifically around aesthetics, and also linked a little bit perhaps to Giovanni's arguments, and I would also bring up a very interesting PhD just finished by Isaskun Chinchilla, which it just came out, I haven't read it, but it's about basically arguing that the link to sort of hustle of sustainable architecture lies in aesthetics, in our judgment. And I would say for myself, maybe it relates to Adam's arguments, that I would think when I judge styles or aesthetics of architecture, if I judge it, and if I have an idea too early, I see that as a kind of, I've been conquered, and then I need to conquer it back to really understand, do I really judge this too early or not? So kind of an open question to see, is there a possibility that qualities could be seen and therefore it could be not junk? Because it's easy to kind of judge, malls are like these enormous buildings that are very easily just kind of scraped off as being junk. Whereas perhaps there could be quality in something that does actually exist.
Who wants to answer?
Yes, please.
Very interesting question. First of all, my understanding of aesthetics, sorry if I'm mistaken, is something that includes everything under the label of aesthetics, including the relation of a building to a place, to a certain context, its role, etc. However, saying that, as architects, we are not sociologists. You raised an important issue, whether we judge something immediately or after we leave. No, I mean, this thing sort of was fermenting in my mind until after I left. But then again, I'm not the sole authority on this issue. If you want to be a sociologist, you may go and do, survey the people who are living there, who are using the mall, and they could mean multiple meanings to different people. For instance, the Kaunas Mall, if you look at it from the perspective of people who were living for 50 years under a Soviet regime, they may see this as an example or as a catalyst for a certain emancipation. They may not have any sort of sort of awkward feeling towards it. The people in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, on the other hand, they may also see it as a kind of emancipation, but there's a certain connection to the identity, to the people, to the particularities of the place that is somehow missing, and that I found, by contrast, in the Norman Foster mall, which is also a kind of mall. So, you know, if you ask me what I favor, is definitely the Norman Foster option rather than these kind of bland, you know, repetitions of the same sort of typologies of the Toronto and the malls in the United States that have been imported as part of this economic system. But you know, I'm not here in the game of, or in the role of a sociologist trying to see what do these things mean differently to different people and whether they relate to a place or not. I'm here to look at them from the position of an architect and to see which ones somehow make sense, which ones somehow participate also in the making of a certain contemporary architectural identity. And here I'm not advocating at all a return to some kind of fundamental or original condition, whether it is the Maui or the primitive sort of architecture or the notion of Heidegger's notion of dwelling. I'm not into that at all. I'm all for a contemporary condition, but that is articulated and critically evaluated by the people in a certain place and context. On this point, I want to just say one more thing. Recently, I read a very interesting book on Moneo. It was the first study on Moneo. I forgot the name of the author, but it's called, you know, on Raphael Moneo, building, dwelling, something. I don't know. Building, thinking, something. And it's you know, if you really look at it carefully and evaluate or critically read that book, and you compare it to the studies on other architects, there's a big difference between the approach that this architect takes versus others.
Can I just ask you? Oh, yes, sir. No, you guys are going to ask.
Yeah.
I'll get you the name of the book.
I want to say that when we think that the malls he's talking about are perhaps junk space, I have the feeling we are judging not the architecture, but the society, the consumerist society that promoted it. And because I was thinking, I don't want to be rude toward my hosts, but I was thinking about this building. Is this building site-specific? I mean, I saw this building nearly the same thing in Lausanne, in Penn University. I mean, also my high-grade school in Milan was very similar to this building, and we don't think it's junk space because it's universities, and we produce culture here, so we are not I don't know.
You went first? Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I think when we talk about junk space, it was actually this space here, right?
Yeah.
Collas wouldn't say that shopping mall is junk space. That's also, I could say that, you know, if you're interested, you can run a studio in Harvard, maybe have a book called Book About Shopping, which claims that Victor Gruen was, you know, a great architect, which architecture with a capital A ignored for years. Maybe. But I think actually, you know, I mean, there's fundamental issues with shopping malls which go beyond design issues.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you know, they rose as a kind of solution for suburbia as a public space in the absence of public space. And a good shopping mall can't offer or solve the problems which are inherent in that form in those specific conditions. So that's where we exhaust, let's say, the aesthetic dimensions, if you like, of solving these issues. So that's my position. Thank you.
I guess I kind of was just feeling exactly the same as what Giovanni said, in the sense that I do hear criticisms about these kinds of spaces and people saying they're the same all over the world, and I guess what the question that comes to my mind is, why do people talk about things like shopping centres, skyscrapers, these sort of the embodiments of large-scale capital as being something imposed from the outside? you know, you can be in the center of the capitalist world, that's late capitalist world in London or New York, and people still talk about it as being something that is enforced from somewhere else, right? As a sort of vague miasma of evil corporate wealth that's just imposed. But actually, no, it's generated from the places. It's universal. We all share it. These shopping malls they're placed in these places because people want them, because wealth is generated. It's universal. It's not coming in an imperial way from one specific location and being imposed on people. You know, like growing up and seeing, particularly so, for instance, Israel, going from the 80s to the 90s when shopping malls arrived there, you know, it wasn't like people were forced to go to the shopping malls. People were clamoring for them. You know, they were just so excited to be able to live this kind of lifestyle. It was something that was willingly taken on by them. And so I just think that it would be nice to see it, you know, the way that perhaps you'd see classical architecture spreading around the world and actually looking very similar, one building from one country to another, but treating it as if it's a, you know, it's nonetheless of the location and universal at the same time, rather than just because it's an architecture that's produced now, we critique it as being evil, universal, as coming from somewhere else. So I think we should just take it on its terms as it is, in a place, and actually, you know, just because it looks potentially slightly like something in New York doesn't mean that it's bad. It's of its place. People are living in it. They're having their experiences. People in Beirut are going to be remembering that architecture as theirs, as they're having their memories in that place. So.
Okay, let's continue.
Can I just
reply?
I just wanted to mention the book I mentioned is Rafael Murillo Building, Teaching Writing by Francisco González de Canales. Okay. The first title was better.
One thing, there's a question? Okay. Better.
Yeah, he just
I'm supposed to only moderate.
Well, it's not really a question, maybe more of a comment. Seems like we're tiptoeing around this thing a little bit, which is a kind of question of material, and specifically the kind of aesthetics of decay, I suppose. And, you know, when you're talking about decay, Renaissance as a global project, it's true, right? There are all these things everywhere, but the way they look now, I think, is probably a lot more appealing to us because of the way they're built, or even the way they're decayed. And we haven't seen the same thing happening with either, you know, modernist buildings or even postmodern. And actually, postmodern buildings are probably the worst ones in this case, because they made out of God knows what. And it's actually interesting that, Adam, you chose to deal with ceramics as opposed to any other material, which is kind of in itself is a statement. It's a kind of very durable and kind of desirable touch. And the kind of a strange example for me that comes to mind is, let's say, the Narkom Fin building in Moscow, which is kind of in the context of itself, but because it's literally falling apart and the stucco is falling off, this kind of machine-like qualities are, in a way, being replaced by this kind of the brick wall that's falling apart. And it's actually very much in context with the surrounding area, with the buildings from the 18th century. So I guess, as a comment/question, like, what do you guys think about materials in relationship to what's been said?
Are there other questions? We can maybe collect. Sorry.
Okay. Who was that?
I surely don't want that.
Nobody wants to touch materials.
Okay, so it's your turn now. You are the first. Material.
Why did you start there? Why did you choose the ceramics instead of? I mean, I think I saw chocolate. As a material, no?
No.
Oh.
It was leaking.
Yeah, the licking, and before we had brown stuff. That was not chocolate, unfortunately. Brown ceramics. Before the licking video, you had something brown, 3 shapes like little cakes. Yeah. No, that was ordered from
White
material
like
things.
clean chocolates.
Yeah, that's clay.
Oh.
It's like, that's just simply clay before it's been fired. So it goes white when you fire it. Sorry.
Okay.
It's like chocolate.
Ceramics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be truly honest, with ceramics, I've just I kind of came to it by mistake. Because it's actually such a readily available material. It's very cheap. It's easy to use. It's very accessible. And as an individual person, you can work with it without having to spend a lot of money. But also, you know, having come into it and worked with it a lot then over kind of several years. It's coming back into architecture now. In London, there's quite a few projects where people are starting to use that on facades in interesting ways, in 3-dimensional, in three-dimensional forms that are not tiles, as well, because there's this return of craft to, or there's this desire for craft to return to the practice of architecture via the digital, which is quite interesting. It's a little bit like.
I haven't written.
Sorry.
I was just advertising a call for paper for craft.
Oh, okay.
But I like it.
But there's so I think it's a little bit like, I was talking about, there's this return, well, as you mentioned very clearly, it's an issue. It's just a sort of a side effect of modernity, right? There's a desire to return to things that we know when everything is changing around us. It's very difficult, and I think when construction technology is changing so much, there's a very, very comfortable quality that something like ceramic has, that it ties back into architectures of the past. Our cities are covered in ceramic facade buildings. That it's got that nostalgic aspect, but at the same time, because of the digital technology, it allows people in the avant-garde, people in academia, or people who are sort of pushing formal aspects of architecture to feel that it's still progressive. So I can comfort myself and say, I'm being progressive, but look, I could also put it in a building in London because it's just like all these classic ceramic facades from the 19th century. So it does sort of perform.
So you chose it actually.
Sorry?
You selected it, it's not just by choice.
Yeah, well, it was by chance initially.
Well, gunpowder was invented by chance too, so.
But then at the same time, I started to meet architects who were working with it, like Eric Parry, and actually talking about how it can go into production, how it works in architecture, and projects have been produced over the past 8 years that work with it in that way. In fact, Friend and Company's shop in the V&A just opened yesterday, which is sort of like a test case in how 3D printed tiles can be used in large traffic areas. In public spaces, so it's the first time that they have been used in an architectural environment. So it's very much current, and I think it's sort of naughty in the sense that it takes care of all those evil conservative attitudes of wanting to be local and wanting to be vernacular, but at the same time being progressive a little bit as well.
Yeah, about material. I don't think that Renaissance architect chose to build buildings that decayed well. I mean, that was the way you build in 15th century. In the same way, I don't think that we have really a choice as architects to build in a certain way or in another. I mean, the means of construction, you find them. I think there's a problem of omnipotence for many architects. They say, we have to change the world, architecture has to change the world, but it's not architect that changes the world. I mean, they are not on command.
I'm not entirely agreeing. I think the Renaissance architects were trying to copy Romans, also in the building technology. The Rome they looked at was the Roman decay.
Palladio built his columns in bricks and not in marble.
No, but the Romans did that too. I mean, the idea of veneer is Roman, is not Renaissance.
I wouldn't agree. I mean, the Roman columns were in marble, not in marble, not in bricks and veneer.
The walls are veneered.
Well, but yeah, the buildings were veneered, which we just don't see because it's been reused. But there's not much Roman veneer that survives because it's all been
reused.
Spoliated.
Yeah, but we were at the question of contemporary materiality and decay, right? Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, if you look around, I mean, we see it. We have basically the reinforced concrete columns and slabs, and then the cladding. And the cladding is, of course, something that does not age well. But on the other side, I think that's exactly where I think it's also inevitable. It's like the architecture we do. Of course, it can be Peter Zumthor and build monolithic with walls of almost a meter. But I mean, that's the high end put to your whatever it is. But if you are in the real world of normal architecture, I think it's the ability to actually think that ahead. I mean, design is architecture. To use your categories. Maybe they differentiate in that an architect still uses drywalls, plywood, glass, aluminum facade systems or something in a way that is intentional. And intentional can also mean that it is replaceable, maintainable, or whatever. Or you just, stumble it together and glue it together. And, what Ram was calling Johnson.
I just think like that.
There's a nobility, maybe. There's even a nobility. I mean, like the Renaissance brick pretending to be marble, there is also nobility of sheetrock.
In terms of the...
This is, by the way, halfway good. I mean, if the lights would be exactly the same as the boards, I think we would be really talking.
But ancient tower, was all covered with stucco, but because that was the intention.
No, the intention
to
was to do
look
concrete.
Yes,
Yeah.
The intention was to be concrete, but it was bricks with stucco. Right?
Yeah.
But the kind of message was there,
Yeah.
stylistically.
The vacuum theater I showed was supposed to be concrete.
That's what we could do.
Yeah.
It was available, because of money and all that. But they were very keen to correct the stucco to make it look like concrete.
The solarium of Villa Savoie, same thing.
Yeah, and many examples.
I think it's just a matter of time. Like in terms of, every era, I think they think that their ruins are going to be bad. Like I think the modernists thought, oh no, our architecture is so completely different, and yet you have a situation where the White City in Tel Aviv is, before they did it all up and gentrified it so it all looks brand shining new, but you had all of these fake concrete buildings with the plaster falling off and you saw the brick behind. And there's an incredible romance to that of course we appreciated, but they would have been horrified by. And I think similarly, right, the postmodern architecture that maybe a lot of people don't like, but it's aged really badly, a lot of it, because it's effectively clip-on, the early clip-on architecture with quite cheap materials. But actually, the kind of dirtiness, which has happened in only 25 years in a lot of them, like my generation really likes, like we find really nostalgic and beautiful. I think it's just a matter of time. All you need is a couple of decades and every single type of building, just with a patina of time, becomes beautiful.
The wishful thinking, I'm not sure how aesthetically you are yourself as a person sensitive to aesthetic issues. Because if you are, not everything goes, not everything is beautiful.
But with time it does.
No, I don't think so. I think nostalgically, it's culturally, it's a different kind of attributes and pushes. But
I think one of the best examples is actually industrial buildings, because in many of these countries, really not long ago, after architects were already fascinated with this, most people would associate every industrial building with dirt, pollution.
Well, now it's
That's
it's
a short time. The perception of reality is. So suddenly they associate it with cultural industries, with all kinds of other things happening, and they don't seem so.
so when we feel we lose something, we want it. So it's like there are many examples of that.
And that happens to anything.
We're not even,
But it's
loss.
not for the aesthetic reason.
But this question,
It's not even the loss. I think
this question was a kind of sabotage. Diverted the discussion away from where it was,
Sorry, guys.
I think about aesthetics.
Maybe we can return it to your case. I mean, because the question of materiality is normally very much affiliated with the idea of local, vernacular, place-based design. So, what do you make out of it?
That's another. I've got an easy question. To connect materiality to what we were talking about before, right? A retiree in Edinburgh published a book last year about social housing in Scotland, not in the main cities. Work, which hasn't been published, not by famous architects. And he traveled around, he has photographs, he published this book, and he was doing a presentation, a book launch if you like. A lot of people who attended it were not academics, were people active in the heritage industry and so on, but also just locals. And he was showing these slides, and some of these buildings were made of stucco, some were made of stone. In fact, the reason some were from stucco and some from stone, it depended, it was inter-warriors, depending on what was available, right? So some cases, and it's all about social housing, and the social housing and the plans are what matters. And you should have heard the audience say, why those ugly stucco buildings and why that one's so beautiful. So again, if you like, from his perspective, looking at the wrong thing, because that's not what mattered. What mattered was the quality of life offered by these council housing projects from the inter-warriors. And here the focus of so many, the audience was, is it stone, it's good, if it's stucco, it's bad, which is the wrong issue.
So I just, an anecdote, but like I grew up next to what is known as the most expensive social housing that's ever been built in history. It's in Hampstead in London. It's exquisite houses with gardens on top of each other, and you would kill to live in that place. And I would go there quite regularly in awe of the beauty of this project.
What's the name? Which one?
I can't remember the name.
Address.
It's Branch Hill. Sorry, it's Branch Hill Housing. And I'd go there, and obviously I'd want to speak to the people. They hated it. They hated it, and they had the most amazing, duplex, triplex apartment houses things. You know why they hated it? Because it was made of concrete.
No, but it does reflect on the, the desirability or what nostalgia is towards or not. It's nothing to do with the real aesthetics. It's to do with the many other attributes and feelings, and nothing to do with it's beautiful or not beautiful.
But you seem to be saying that there was an objective.
Can I throw you into Bourdieu's distinction about taste, because it's really about how taste is constructed by class, and in a way the aspect of respectability for lower class people is very important. If high-rise housing is associated in Britain with poverty, then they don't want it. I mean, think about the experiment going on today in London, where it's actually rich people who are forced to live in high-rise, and how things in the long run are going to change. But also to mention shortly this aspect of the amateur versus, let's say, the expert, and how both opinions of amateur and expert are part of the same system, even if their opinions are different and opposed at one moment. And each affirms the system in different ways, strangely enough, right? Because of course you have a very different, let's say, lay taste compared to expert taste in architecture, and yet still, both are two sides of the same coin at the end of the day. They're not really as different as we may think they are.
Is there any way to get outside of that kind of social construction of taste in which we're all trapped?
I don't see that as a main problem, actually. It's not the main issue.
So it's talking about the floor plans. That's the way we escape it.
Well, that's how we change the focus, if we manage to.
But then there should be focus on both, because we should be able to talk about both.
Well, if we remain within capitalism as we are going to remain, one of the tricks is actually, the question of which cultures filter up and which go down. One of the interesting things about the subcultures of the last decades, that unusually they filtered up. That's not common. Usually cultures filtered down. You become respectable by imitating those who are socially superior. So the normal way would be pushing the rich into high-rise, and then later you can get the others into the high-rise. So, but that's a very kind of, how they call it, cynical approach, based on what is going on anyway today, driven by market forces.
I don't think the filtering up is unusual. I mean, the whole exoticization of the poor has been going on since the 18th century. That's completely normal. It goes both ways. And the other, no?
I think, since we are both quite, three of us at least, are familiar with Tel Aviv, maybe others as tourists. But there are a lot of towers, like boring towers part of north of Tel Aviv. And a lot of rich people, well-off people, which are very popular neighborhood, let's say. And I'm very familiar with three towers in other neighborhoods in London, which is social housing, in the edge of Belsize Park.
At Adelaide Road, the three towers on Adelaide Road.
Yeah, there are three towers. Maybe there are 4 or 5 actually, but there are 4, okay. But there are 4 towers in Adelaide Road, not because there are 2 also opposite, anyhow, it's for one opposite. That it was built as social housing. It's categorized always as the ugliest home. So I take a photograph of them and show it to people in Tel Aviv and say, oh, this is really well-off people living here in Belsize Park. It's an amazing tower because of also what they look on location. So I think the social aspect and our references, it's nothing to do with the aesthetics of architecture. It has so many other attributes and emotions. It's not the aesthetic emotion, as used to call it clientele.
That's it. I mean, that's one of the interesting things I've been observing since the financial crash of 2008-9, because then in the United States at least, the suburbs suddenly failed rather than the inner core cities. And now the rich move into the inner core cities, and now it is considered to be lower class to be actually in the suburbs. So the whole mentality starts to change. And there is one of those paradigm shifts in Bourdieu's taste culture, where it suddenly becomes achievable or desirable for people to move back into the cities, and that of course hipster phenomenon, all that kind of stuff puts onto that. But suddenly, in the United States, where it was always looked down to live in apartment houses, suddenly apartment houses have become the thing. And of course, we see the extremes of that in cities like New York with the skinny towers. But it's happening in Salt Lake City, in Portland, in all smaller kinds of cities. Yeah, exactly. The suburbs is less desirable. I have to move to the suburb because I cannot afford a city apartment. That's the argument now, right?
Just an anecdote, but there's just in terms of the bottom-up sort of idolization of culture coming from below that does happen in capitalism and has happened for a long time. Dappy from N-Dubs, who was a big pop star in the UK, was from one of the towers in Adelaide Road, and there's like videos of him going like, yeah, man. Outside, I'm from Camden, man. And that those towers have been idolized in popular culture by kind of normal middle-class kids as being really cool places to go to, because there's that sort of desire to sort of emulate those people from below. So there's kind of there is taste moving in multiple directions. And I think it's always happened.
Which is it's very interesting, but it does confirm what we already said.
It's something that I've wondered though is that in terms of like taste cultures, okay, we're talking on a very big scale now, sort of about social movement between different classes, and then general tastes that shift over decades that move with them. But like, what about within architecture? If we had multiple tastes, if each of us were developing much more unusual aesthetics and ways of working, so that actually architecture became more like fashion, and that actually there was more stylistic and aesthetic kind of subcultures or ways of working in architecture, if we found a way of making that kind of be produced through the construction industry, so that actually there'd be more of a real capitalist world out there where taste culture and architecture could represent social movements actually more fluidly than they do now.
We are slower. It's a slow industry.
Well, but there's also a herd mentality.
Never have the speed of music.
It would be great, but there's just a problem. How much time lasts a building, and how much time lasts a sweater?
I mean, I would also say that the multiplicity of difference becomes nothing. That's what you have. Difference. It has nothing to measure against.
Well, that's the city of the captive globe you've shown.
Yes,
that is already
exactly.
But that's not real, by the way.
Yeah, but it's the multiplicity.
It's a metaphorical analysis of the situation.
On the anecdote
From
the different disciplines on the anecdote level, that's a pop musician in conversations that, in pop music, actually, there are lots of bad songs in there, but when we look historically, they're all forgotten, and what we see, looking back, we remember only the good ones, and we have the pleasure of listening to the good ones, because the bad ones are just not there anymore. Is that architecturally, all the bad things are still in the streets. We can't just enjoy.
Who's to say it's bad?
We can't just enjoy all the good ones.
But picking up on that sort of analogy, music, 1 year everyone's talking about specific types of electric music from the 80s, and then 5 years later they're all talking about guitar music from the 80s. So they're rediscovering those things, right, that are there. And in architecture it could be the same, where things come, they're still there, and they're rediscovered each time, rather than just a monolithic group of architects from a particular period doing the same thing. Because I think it's not true. We just don't for 50 years remember one type of music from a period. We rediscover things at different times relating to what we're going through. And we could do the same for architecture.
May I, on the note of if architecture could develop more fluidly, say that that's something that we might see developing. I can be just loud. That's in the note of if architecture could develop more fluidly. We might see that happening with virtual reality, which is going to become more and more the format where architecture will develop. I mean, it's already there. The experiences are already quite good, quite acceptable. And very soon there's going to be entire worlds being created in one afternoon. And I think there is where we might miss the boat, we architects, if we are not ready to jump on it. Because people is just going to go on and start creating worlds. And I think there is a huge opportunity for architects that are actually trained as architects to exercise the design of experiences in there. And in there, I think, because of the speed and the cheapness of means, basically, you just need computer power to do that and experience it. I think we might see a lot more fluid development of niche movements, just because you can't try it. You don't need to just show it as a render, or you don't need the money of a client to develop it. So I am really looking forward to that.
Just one thing. I was asked by the organizational staff to close, so maybe this is the last round of answers.
You conclude.
The discussion.
I like you conclude. Also, either you sing a song or you conclude.
No, I conclude.
Or you can dance.
Now, first of all, I can say that we can continue this very beautiful conversation. There's a buffet, I think, or something. Yes, food and alcohol, hopefully. Yes. But it was very, I mean, we've been talking for 1 hour, which is very fluidly, so I think it was great. The only thing I can say, I just remember one thing that Umberto Eco wrote about the radio, no? The content is the same, but then once you build the radio, you can make it look anywhere you like, because it's in the market, and then you want to make it to fit your own taste. It's curious that we're still having dualities in between function and form, political project architecture, aesthetic approach of architecture, pop culture, high culture. Maybe we should keep on talking about that, because I kind of felt projected into the 70s, but maybe we're not there anymore. Okay? But thank you, everybody, to our invited guests and everybody in the public. I'll see you around in front of the beers bar.